One signature could erase your name from a slave owner's ledger forever. One musket could make you a free man, and one bullet could make sure you never lived long enough to enjoy either. In 1778, that was the choice facing dozens of enslaved men in Rhode Island. Fight for a revolution that still couldn't decide whether you were truly free or remain someone else's property for the rest of your life. Most people know the story of the 54th Massachusetts. Almost nobody knows the men who came 85 years before them. The men who stood their ground against Europe's most feared soldiers and proved that freedom was worth dying for. This is the forgotten story of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Remember one name before we start: Gilbert Totten. He's not a general. He's not in any textbook. He's a man who got humiliated by a prisoner guard in 1781 and swore revenge for it. What he does with that grudge, 3 years after the moment we're about to show you, is the reason this story doesn't end the way you think it's going to. Subscribe now, because I promise you, you do not want to only see the first half of this. Let's go back to the winter that started it all. Winter, 1777, Valley Forge. Washington's army was starving and freezing to death faster than the British could ever kill them. Nearly 3,000 men, Washington wrote to Congress, were unfit for duty, barefoot, and in his words, otherwise naked. About 12,000 soldiers marched into that camp. Roughly 2,000 of them would be dead by spring, not from bullets, but from typhus, smallpox, and cold. Burial details couldn't dig graves fast enough to keep pace with the dying. And every week, more men walked away for good, their enlistments up, with nothing left to keep them there. Nobody could really blame them. The government couldn't feed them, couldn't clothe them, couldn't even guarantee they'd get paid. The Continental Army was shrinking at the exact moment it needed to grow. Rhode Island's regiments had collapsed to a few hundred men. The state was out of white volunteers, and the British sat comfortably in Newport, holding one of New England's most valuable ports. That's when General James Varnum stepped forward with an idea that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Varnum was a lawyer from Rhode Island and one of Washington's most trusted officers, and he'd watched his own state fail, over and over, to fill its recruiting quotas. In January 1778, he wrote directly to Washington, "Raise a full battalion out of the enslaved population." Washington didn't approve the plan, but he didn't kill it either. He passed it to Rhode Island's governor and let the state decide. He needed soldiers too badly to say no. On February 14, 1778, Rhode Island passed the Slave Enlistment Act. Any enslaved man who passed muster before Colonel Christopher Greene would be immediately freed, absolutely free, in the law's own words. In a country fighting a war over liberty, enslaved men were being told they could buy their own freedom with a musket, for a nation that hadn't yet decided if they counted as people. It wasn't clean. Slave owners were paid back from the public treasury for their property. The state was essentially purchasing men out of bondage and handing them a uniform. Plenty of owners fought the law hard anyway, warning publicly that these men would just be used as cannon fodder, thrown into the worst assignments and sacrificed. That freedom bought this way wasn't real freedom at all. Some spread the word deliberately, trying to talk enslaved men out of enlisting at all, insisting the whole thing was a trap. The act faced backlash from the moment it passed, but within 4 months, more than 130 men enlisted, 88 of them walking straight out of bondage, many from the state's largest slaveholding families, in a colony with a total black and indigenous population of barely 3,300 people. That's not a small number. That's close to 3% of the entire population choosing a musket over the alternative. They were joined by free black men and Narragansett fighters looking to protect what was left of their own sovereignty in a world that was rapidly closing in on it. The regiment reached about 225 soldiers, 140 of them black or Native American, the only unit in the Continental Army with fully segregated companies of color. Every other black soldier in Washington's army was scattered thin, 1 or 2 to a company. folded quietly into otherwise white units. This was something different, and something the British had never faced before. An entire fighting force built out of men who'd been legal property just months earlier, standing shoulder to shoulder under their own flag. For these men, this war was never just about taxes or a king 3,000 miles away. It was about whether they'd spend the rest of their lives as someone else's property. Every battle from here on was personal. In a way, it simply wasn't, for the man standing next to them. Colonel Christopher Green, already a proven commander from the defense of Fort Mercer, where 400 Americans had held off 2,000 Hessians, was handed the job of turning enslaved men who'd never held a weapon into soldiers. It wasn't a small task. These were men who'd spent their entire lives being told, by law, that they weren't allowed to touch a musket, weren't allowed near a militia drill, weren't trusted with anything sharper than a farm tool. Now they were being asked to master formation marching, coordinated volley fire, and bayonet drills against the clock, with the rest of the army watching to see if the experiment would fail. At Valleyforge, a Prussian drillmaster named Baron von Steuben was rebuilding the whole Continental Army from scratch. Loud, foul-mouthed, and relentless, drilling soldiers in the snow until movements that used to take a minute happened in seconds. Green's men trained in those same frozen fields, alongside everyone else, learning to march, load, and fight in formation for the first time in their lives. By late spring, the regiment had taken its final shape, 60 privates of color and 12 white officers, under Captain Thomas Arnold, plus 6 white musicians rounding out the ranks. Their first real test came at Monmouth in June 1778, fighting through a brutal New Jersey summer from afternoon until dusk. Captain Thomas Arnold took a musket ball to the leg and had to be carried off the field. Several of his men were wounded, including a soldier named Richard Rhodes, born in Africa, who'd later write in his own pension application that he'd served the Army of the Revolution for 5 years and bled for it at Monmouth. But the real test, the one that would define them, was still 2 months away, on a hilltop over Narragansett Bay. The plan to retake Newport fell apart fast. A French fleet under Admiral d'Estaing arrived off the coast with warships and 4,000 troops, meant to trap the British by sea while General Sullivan's 10,000 Americans attacked by land. For a moment, it looked promising. The British were outnumbered and outgunned. Then a British relief fleet showed up, d'Estaing sailed out to meet them, and before either side could fire a shot, a massive storm tore through and battered both fleets. The British limped back to New York. The French, leaking and damaged, sailed off to Boston for repairs instead of coming back to help. Without the French Navy sealing the harbor, thousands of American militia realized there was no longer any real chance of taking Newport, and simply packed up and walked home overnight. Sullivan's army was cut in half. He had no choice but to retreat. The British saw their chance. On August 29, 1778, they sent Hessian mercenaries, some of the most feared professional soldiers in the world, veterans of decades of European wars, straight at the part of the American line they expected to break first, Turkey Hill, held by the 1st Rhode Island. Newly formed, untested, made of men who, months earlier, had never been allowed to hold a weapon at all. Around 10 a.m., British warships anchored offshore and opened up with cannon fire on Nathaniel Greene's position. Under cover of that bombardment, the Hessians started up the slope. The Hessians charged. The line held and drove them back down the hill. They regrouped and charged again, bayonets fixed, drums pounding, coming in force this time. The line held again. A third charge came, just as hard as the first two, and broke against the same wall of musket fire. By now, the fighting had turned genuinely brutal. The slopes were littered with Hessian dead and wounded. The creek at the base of the hill ran red. Locals would later name it Bloody Run Creek. The 1st Rhode Island did not yield a single foot of ground through all 3 assaults. Around 2 p.m., the Hessians tried one final push up the hill, and failed again, same as before. When Nathaniel Greene finally ordered the counterattack, it was the 1st Rhode Island's own line, alongside Massachusetts militia, that drove the Hessians back to the summit. In his official report to Congress, Sullivan singled the regiment out by name, writing that they were entitled to a proper share of the honors of the day. The Marquis de Lafayette, present during the campaign, reportedly called it the best fought action of the entire war. High praise from a man who'd already seen most of it firsthand. The numbers told the real story. The British and Hessians suffered roughly 260 casualties that day, 128 of them from the German units that had thrown themselves at that hill 3 separate times. The regiment that had absorbed the worst of it, the regiment nobody expected to hold, lost 1 man killed, 10 wounded. A witness at the time summed it up in 2 words: desperate valor. Newport wasn't liberated that day, and within 4 months, the Slave Enlistment Act itself was repealed. Slave owners lobbied hard, and Rhode Island voters threw out more than half the legislators who'd supported it. No more black or native men were enlisted after that. But the men already serving kept their freedom and kept fighting, year after year. Garrison duty, prisoner details at Philadelphia's Stone Jail, the same miserable marches that defined the whole Continental Army, while their regiments slowly integrated with white replacements. Not by anyone's design, just by attrition, 1 casualty at a time, until black, native, and white soldiers were serving in the same companies as equals in everything but the law. By 1781, they were guarding a river crossing in New York called Pines Bridge, the so-called neutral ground between American and British lines, a lawless stretch where loyalist raiders and partisan gangs operated with almost no consequences. Colonel Greene set up headquarters at the Davenport House, about 2 miles south of the bridge itself. Weeks earlier, a loyalist informant named Gilbert Totten had been detained there and held under guard by black soldiers. For a man who considered himself their superior by every law of the land, that alone was humiliating. Witnesses said he swore revenge on the spot, promising that the next time he came back, it would be under a red flag, and the black soldiers stationed there would soon disappear. On May 14, 1781, he came back with roughly 260 men, 60 dragoons, and 200 Loyalist infantry, crossing the river before dawn. They struck the Davenport House without warning. Greene's second-in-command, Major Ebenezer Flagg, was shot dead through a window as he reached for his pistols. Greene himself leaped out of bed, grabbed his sword, and tried to rally his men, reportedly shouting that the attackers were nothing but a parcel of cowboys. By every surviving eyewitness account, it was only over the dead bodies of his black soldiers that the enemy reached him at all. At least 8 of them died defending a commander who had once outranked them by every law of the country they were fighting for, with 2 more dying later of their wounds. Greene's body was found in the woods nearly a mile away, mutilated in a way witnesses called shocking. Brutality specifically aimed, most accounts agree, at a white officer who had dared to command black troops. Some of the captured soldiers, by several accounts, were shipped to the West Indies and sold back into slavery. Men who had bled for their freedom, possibly ending their lives in chains on a sugar plantation instead. The regiment survived anyway. That October, they joined the final push to Yorktown, storming a British redoubt in a night bayonet charge across open ground in total darkness, scaling the earthen walls by hand under fire. Exactly the kind of close-quarters violence European commanders had assumed men who'd once been enslaved would never be capable of. 2 days later, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army, and the war was effectively over. The 1st Rhode Island disbanded on Christmas Day, 1783. One of the only units in the entire Continental Army to serve from the war's very first year to its very last. Their final commander told them in his last address that he held them in what he called his most affectionate regard and esteem. Then, with what must have been real frustration, he noted that these men were being sent home with pay the government still owed them. They went home, still owed pay the government never settled. no land grants, no pensions on time, no recognition. Some handed their enlistment bounties straight back to the men who used to own them, just to formally close the book on their own bondage. Others worked several jobs a week just to get by. They'd bought their freedom on a battlefield. But freedom, it turned out, didn't come with much else attached to it. For nearly 2 centuries, almost nobody remembered their name at all. The flag they carried from Valleyforge to Yorktown still survives today, kept at the Rhode Island State House in Providence. In 2025, it was loaned out to the National Museum of the United States Army for the Army's 250th anniversary. There's a monument on the ground they died defending in Portsmouth, and a bronze sculpture in Yorktown Heights showing Christopher Green standing beside a black soldier and a Narragansett fighter, the 3 faces of a regiment that came from nowhere and disappeared from the history books almost as fast. A French officer named Jean-Baptiste de Versia even painted them at Yorktown, one of the only contemporary images that exists of these men, made by an ally who actually watched them fight. One signature could erase a man's name from a ledger. One musket could make him free. One bullet could make sure he never lived long enough to enjoy either. Gilbert Totten made sure of the third one. Nearly a century before the 54th Massachusetts made its famous charge at Fort Wagner, this regiment had already answered the same question the 54th would later be asked. Is freedom worth dying for? They answered it on Turkey Hill. They answered it again in the woods outside a house that isn't on any map you've seen, defending a man with their own bodies. And then the country forgot them anyway. Historian Henry Winchek later made an observation worth sitting with. There's no record of white soldiers ever objecting to fighting beside them. No record of disciplinary problems. No record of unrest over the integration itself. The resistance never came from the men in the ranks, freezing and bleeding together at Valleyforge and Yorktown. It came from the men in power, sitting comfortably far from any battlefield, who had the luxury of deciding these soldiers' worth from a distance. That's the part of this story that should sit with you longest. The men who actually fought beside them had no problem at all. It was only the people who never had to face a Hessian bayonet who decided these soldiers didn't deserve to be remembered. There's a version of history where this regiment gets a Hollywood movie and a chapter in every textbook. This isn't that version. This is the version where you're one of maybe a few thousand people who's ever heard Christopher Green's name. If you want to be one of the people who keep stories like this from disappearing a second time, that's what subscribing here actually does. And I want to know, after everything you just watched, who do you think deserves justice more? Christopher Green, or the men who died in the woods trying to save him? Fight it out in the comments. I'm reading all of them.